Picture this: a tiny village in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by hostile tribes, wild animals, and a river that floods every spring just to make things interesting. This village has no armies, no wealth, and no one expects much from it. Yet, somehow, this backwater turns into the most powerful empire in human history. What if I told you it all started with 2 orphaned babies, a she-wolf, and a series of pretty questionable decisions? Yeah, things get weird. Welcome to the real origin story of ancient Rome. Stick around. You won't believe how it all went down. When people think of ancient Rome, they think of glorious marble statues, massive armies marching in unison, emperors in golden crowns, and gladiators fighting to the death in front of cheering crowds. But that's not how it all started. The Rome we know and love didn't just pop into existence fully formed. It had humble beginnings, and I mean really humble. We're talking about a tiny settlement of misfits just trying to survive in a swampy mess of a landscape. And that's not even the crazy part. Nope, we're diving into a story filled with wolves, betrayal, and some seriously questionable decision-making. So how did ancient Rome go from mud huts to world domination? Buckle up, because it's a wild ride. Let's set the scene. The year is somewhere around 753 BCE, and Rome is basically a mess. It's not the bustling metropolis we imagine today. There's no Colosseum, no fancy aqueducts, and no legions marching around. It's just a collection of huts on a hill, surrounded by thick forests, marshes, and, oh yeah, lots of angry neighbors who aren't too thrilled about Rome popping up in their backyard. To make matters worse, Rome is located in a pretty rough spot. It's near the Tiber River, which sounds nice, but let's be real. Rivers back then were more like nature's giant garbage disposal than scenic attractions. Plus, the river floods every spring, turning the surrounding area into a giant swamp. Not exactly prime real estate, so you've got a small group of people living in a soggy, mosquito-infested area with no real resources to speak of, and a bunch of neighboring tribes who would love nothing more than to see them fail. Sounds like a recipe for disaster, right? But that's not even the craziest part. Rome's origin story, the one they actually believed, is straight out of a soap opera, and we're about to dive headfirst into it. Let's set the scene. The year is somewhere around 753 BCE, and Rome is basically a mess. It's not the bustling metropolis we imagine today. There's no Colosseum, no fancy aqueducts, and no legions marching around. It's just a collection of huts on a hill, surrounded by thick forests, marshes, and, oh yeah, lots of angry neighbors who aren't too thrilled about Rome popping up in their backyard. To make matters worse, Rome is located in a pretty rough spot. It's near the Tiber River, which sounds nice, but let's be real. Rivers back then were more like nature's giant garbage disposal than scenic attractions. Plus, the river floods every spring, turning the surrounding area into a giant swamp. Not exactly prime real estate, so you've got a small group of people living in a soggy, mosquito-infested area with no real resources to speak of, and a bunch of neighboring tribes who would love nothing more than to see them fail. Sounds like a recipe for disaster, right? But that's not even the craziest part. Rome's origin story, the one they actually believed, is straight out of a soap opera, and we're about to dive headfirst into it. Exploration, development, 2 minutes, 10 minutes. All right, let's get into the good stuff. The legend of Romulus and Remus. Now I know what you're thinking. Twins raised by a wolf? Really? But hear me out. This story is equal parts ridiculous and awesome, and the Romans believed it for centuries. So here's how it goes. Once upon a time, there was a king named Numitor, who ruled over a city called Alba Longa. Life was good, the crops were growing, and everything seemed pretty chill, until Numitor's evil brother, Amulius, decided he wanted to be king. Amulius did what any villain in a cheesy movie would do. He overthrew Numitor, took the throne, and then thought, how can I make sure no one ever challenges me? Oh, I know. By locking up Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, and forcing her to become a Vestal Virgin. Now, Vestal Virgins were like the ancient world's version of nuns, They weren't allowed to marry or have kids, which in Amulius's mind meant no potential heirs to the throne. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Because the gods are always watching, and in this case, Mars, yes, the literal god of war, decides to step in. He visits Rhea Silvia, and boom, she ends up with twin boys, Romulus and Remus. Now, as you can imagine, Amulius is not happy about this development. So what does he do? Does he send the twins off to live in exile somewhere? Maybe give them to a nice family to raise far away from his kingdom? Nope. He orders the babies to be thrown into the Tiber River to drown. Harsh. But, plot twist, the Tiber River has other plans. Instead of drowning, the twins float downstream in a basket. Classic. Eventually washing ashore near a fig tree. And who should come to their rescue? Not a fisherman, not a kindly shepherd, but a she-wolf. Because why not? The wolf, for reasons that are never quite explained, decides to take the boys in and raise them as her own. Imagine that for a second. 2 human babies being nursed by a wolf. I mean, at this point, the story's basically gone full Jungle Book. But the weirdness doesn't stop there. The boys are eventually discovered by a shepherd named Faustulus, who takes them in and raises them to adulthood. As the twins grow up, they realize they're not just any old shepherds. They've got royal blood. So naturally, they decide to return to Alba Longa, overthrow their evil uncle Amulius, and restore their grandfather Numitor to the throne. Family drama, am I right? But the story doesn't end there. Oh no, because now the twins are ready to strike out on their own. They decide to build a new city on the banks of the Tiber River, right near where they were abandoned as babies. But, surprise, surprise, the brothers can't agree on where to build it. Romulus wants to build on the Palatine Hill while Remus prefers the Aventine Hill. And like all sibling disputes, this one escalates way too quickly. Instead of talking it out like reasonable adults, Romulus and Remus get into a full-blown argument that ends with Romulus killing his own brother. Yikes. With Remus out of the picture, Romulus becomes the sole founder of the city, which he names after himself, Rome. And thus, the legendary city is born. But as epic as this story is, it's just that, a story. So what's the real deal? Well, historians believe that Rome was actually founded around 753 BCE, not by twin brothers raised by wolves, but by a group of Latin-speaking settlers who built a small village on the Palatine Hill. This village wasn't much to look at, just a handful of huts made of wood and mud, surrounded by forests and marshes. The population was probably only a few hundred people at most. These early Romans were farmers and shepherds, not warriors or kings. They lived simple lives, tending to their crops and livestock. But they had one thing going for them: location. Rome was situated in a prime spot near the Tiber River, which gave them access to trade routes and allowed them to control the crossings between different parts of Italy. It wasn't much, but it was something. The real challenge for early Rome wasn't building fancy temples or conquering new lands. It was survival. They were surrounded by rival tribes who weren't too keen on having a new city pop up in their territory. The Latins, the Sabines, and the Etruscans were all bigger, stronger, and more established than the Romans. But Rome had one advantage: they were scrappy. They didn't have the numbers or the resources of their neighbors, but they were willing to fight for what they had. One of the most famous stories from Rome's early days is the tale of the Sabine women. You see, Rome had a bit of a population problem. They didn't have enough women in the city to keep things going. So what did they do? Did they send a polite request to their neighbors for some matchmaking help? Nope. They threw a party. Rome invited the Sabine people to a festival, and while everyone was busy enjoying the food and drinks, the Romans kidnapped the Sabine women. Yep, that's right. They literally stole their future wives. Not exactly the most romantic way to meet someone, but hey, it worked. Naturally, the Sabine men were not happy about this turn of events. They declared war on Rome, and things were about to get ugly. But in a surprising twist, the Sabine women the ones who had been kidnapped, actually stepped in to stop the fighting. They pleaded with both sides to make peace, and eventually, the Sabines and Romans agreed to unite. This was a huge win for Rome because it meant more people, more resources, and more strength. Slowly but surely, Rome was starting to grow. But that was just the beginning. Rome's biggest challenge was yet to come. As Rome began to grow, it attracted the attention of a much more powerful neighbor, the Etruscans. Now, when I say powerful, I mean the Etruscans were essentially the cool kids of ancient Italy. Think of them as the high-tech, artsy, wealthy civilization that everyone either wanted to be friends with or avoid completely because they could absolutely destroy you in a fight. They were way ahead of their time in terms of culture, technology, and military prowess. Meanwhile, the Romans were, well, let's just say they were still figuring things out. The Etruscans were known for their incredible cities, built with advanced architectural techniques like stone walls and temples. They even had a proper sewer system, not just a hole in the ground, mind you, an actual sewage system that made Rome's little mud huts look like primitive Lego creations. They had kings, organized armies, and a culture filled with art, music, and a taste for luxury. Etruscan women, for example, were much more liberated compared to other ancient societies, and they enjoyed prominent roles in public life. Rome, on the other hand, was still in its early stages, more of a scrappy underdog trying to survive, in a dog-eat-dog world. The Romans were still living in huts made of mud and straw, surrounded by forests and marshlands. Their government was more like a loose collection of tribal elders rather than anything resembling a central authority. And their military, let's just say that at this point, the Romans were not exactly known for their military prowess. They were farmers and shepherds, not trained soldiers. The Romans were no match for the Etruscans. If the Etruscans had wanted to, they could have easily wiped out Rome in a single afternoon. But instead of crushing the fledgling city, the Etruscans decided to take a different approach, an approach that would change the course of Roman history forever. The Etruscans didn't just invade and destroy, they decided to civilize the Romans. That's right, they thought, hey, why conquer these scrappy little guys when we can turn them into something useful? This is where things start to get interesting. Enter Tarquinius Priscus, an Etruscan nobleman who would become one of Rome's earliest kings. Yes, kings. Contrary to popular belief, Rome didn't start off as a republic. In its early days, it was a monarchy, and Tarquinius Priscus was the guy who brought a lot of Etruscan influence to the table. Tarquin was a smart, ambitious leader, and for a while, his reign was exactly what Rome needed. Under his leadership, Rome started to develop into a proper city. First off, Tarquinius Priscus began building things. A lot of things. He oversaw the construction of new roads, bridges, and, one of his most important projects, the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's first sewer system. Now, I know what you're thinking. Sewers? Really? That's the big achievement. But hold on, the Cloaca Maxima wasn't just some hole in the ground. It was a massive, sophisticated drainage system that helped turn Rome from a swampy backwater into a city that could actually support a growing population. The Tiber River used to flood the area regularly, turning everything into a muddy mess. But with the Cloaca Maxima, the water could be drained away, and people could build more permanent structures. This might not sound glamorous, but trust me, it was a game changer. It's like the Romans went from swamp villagers to urban planners overnight. But Tarquinius Priscus wasn't done yet. He also built the Roman Forum, which would eventually become the heart of Roman political life, and he expanded the city's defenses with new walls and fortifications. Rome was beginning to look like an actual city, and its population was growing. Things were looking up. But of course, nothing good lasts forever, right? Tarquinius Priscus died after a long and mostly successful reign, and that's when things started to go south. His grandson, Tarquinius Superbus, took over as king. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll know that Superbus doesn't exactly mean super chill or super nice. It means the proud. And let's just say that Tarquinius Superbus lived up to that name in all the worst ways. Superbus was the kind of guy who probably read the Tyranny for Dummies handbook before taking the throne. He ruled with an iron fist, didn't care much for the Senate or any other form of checks and balances for that matter, and was generally an all-around terrible person. He executed rivals left and right, seized land and property from the common people, and made sure to enrich himself at every opportunity. The guy had all the charm of a bad movie villain, only this was real life, and the Romans were living in fear under his reign. Tarquin's cruelty knew no bounds. He even went so far as to have members of his own Senate murdered for questioning his authority. You'd think this kind of behavior would have backfired sooner, but for a while, Tarquin managed to hold on to power through sheer force and fear. The Senate was powerless, the people were terrified, and it seemed like nothing would change. But it wasn't just Tarquin's actions that would lead to his downfall. It was something far more personal. Tarquin's son, Sextus Tarquinius, would end up being the straw that broke the camel's back. You see, Sextus wasn't just following in his father's footsteps of general jerkiness. He took things to a whole new level. One day, while visiting a noble family, Sextus decided he wanted something, or rather, someone, he couldn't have. A woman named Lucretia, who was known for her virtue and beauty. Now, let me just say that if you're trying to win people over, assaulting one of the most respected women in the city is probably not the way to go about it. Sextus's actions caused outrage throughout the city. Lucretia, devastated and ashamed, took her own life after revealing what had happened to her. Her death would become a rallying cry for the Romans. The people had had enough. Enough of Tarquin's cruelty, enough of his son's despicable behavior, and enough of being ruled by a tyrant. Rome was ready for a change, and that change came in the form of a revolution. The revolt that followed wasn't just a bunch of angry citizens waving pitchforks. It was an organized movement led by prominent Roman nobles, including a man named Lucius Junius Brutus. And yes, that name should sound familiar, because this Brutus would later become the ancestor of the Brutus who famously stabbed Julius Caesar. But that's a story for another day. Lucius Junius Brutus was instrumental in rallying the people against Tarquin and his family. He wasn't just motivated by revenge for Lucretia. He wanted to end the monarchy entirely. And in 509 BCE, the Romans did something absolutely unprecedented. They overthrew their king. Tarquinius Superbus and his family were exiled, and the Roman monarchy came to an abrupt and final end. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate how radical this was. Kings had ruled Rome since its foundation. For centuries, the idea of having a king was just how things were done, but the Romans had had enough. They didn't just overthrow Tarquin because he was a bad king. They overthrew him because they wanted to change the very way Rome was governed. And thus, the Roman Republic was born. This was the dawn of a new era, one in which Rome would be ruled not by kings, but by elected officials. From now on, Rome would have 2 consuls instead of a single monarch, and these consuls would be elected by the people, well, the male citizens anyway. The Senate, which had existed under the monarchy but had been mostly powerless, would now play a crucial role in governing the city. It's worth noting that the early Roman Republic wasn't exactly a democracy in the modern sense. Power was still concentrated in the hands of a wealthy elite, and the average Roman citizen didn't have much say in government. But it was a huge step forward compared to the tyranny of Tarquinius Superbus. The people had overthrown a king, and in doing so, they had set Rome on a path toward becoming one of the most powerful republics the world would ever see. The fall of Tarquinius Superbus and the end of the monarchy was a pivotal moment in Roman history. It was the beginning of a political system that would last for nearly 500 years, a system that would see Rome rise from a small city-state to a vast empire that spanned the Mediterranean and beyond. But at the time, the Romans probably didn't realize just how significant this moment was. All they knew was that they had gotten rid of a tyrant, and for the first time in their history, they had the power to shape their own destiny. The Roman Republic wasn't perfect. In fact, it had plenty of flaws, but it was a system that would allow Rome to grow, evolve, and ultimately dominate the ancient world. So there you have it, the wild, wolf-filled origin story of Rome. What started as a tiny settlement of misfits and outcasts on the banks of the Tiber River turned into one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen. And when I say misfits, I mean real misfits. Think about it. The legend of Rome's founding isn't exactly the glamorous origin story you might expect from one of the world's greatest civilizations. I mean, Romulus and Remus were literally raised by a wolf after being abandoned as babies. Talk about a rough start. Yet, it's precisely this rough, scrappy beginning that seems to define Rome. The story of Rome is a story of survival. From the moment those twin brothers washed up on the shores of the Tiber, Rome was a city that had to fight for its place in the world. It was born out of conflict, a fraternal conflict, no less, with Romulus killing Remus to claim the city as his own. From that very first act of violence, Rome's history is filled with clashes, struggles, and moments of extreme adversity. But what's so fascinating about Rome's origin is that despite all the drama, betrayal, and a few stolen wives thrown into the mix, Rome persevered. I mean, think about it. This was a settlement that started out as a collection of huts made of mud and straw. Their neighbours, like the Etruscans and the Greeks in southern Italy, were way more advanced in pretty much every way. The Etruscans had sophisticated cities, the Greeks had philosophers and fancy temples, and the Romans, well, they were just getting started, but that didn't stop them. If anything, it motivated them. Rome's story is a testament to resilience. The city had every reason to fail. It was surrounded by more powerful neighbours. It was built in a swampy area that constantly flooded, and its early leaders weren't exactly experienced statesmen. Yet somehow, against all odds, Rome grew. It adapted. It learned from those around it, especially the Etruscans. And slowly but surely, it began to transform itself into something greater. Under the influence of the Etruscans, Rome went from a disorganized collection of huts to a city with roads, bridges, and a proper sewage system. I know. I keep talking about the sewers, but seriously, the Cloaca Maxima was a big deal. Without it, Rome probably would have drowned in its own filth. It was innovations like this that helped lay the foundation for Rome's future success. And the Romans were smart about it. They didn't just come up with these ideas on their own, they borrowed them from other cultures, adapted them to their needs, and made them work. And then there's the political side of things. The overthrow of Tarquinius Superbus and the establishment of the Roman Republic wasn't just a random fluke. It was a direct response to tyranny, a rejection of the idea that one man should have all the power. The Romans, having lived under a monarchy, knew firsthand the dangers of absolute rule. They had seen what happened when a king like Tarquin abused his power, and they were determined to never let that happen again. So they created something new, a republic where power was shared, and no one man could become too powerful. Now, was the early republic perfect? Not by a long shot. In fact, it was pretty exclusive. Only the wealthy elite had a real say in government, and the average Roman citizen didn't have much power. But it was a start. It was a step towards something more equitable, and over time, the system would evolve to include more voices and more participation. The Republic gave Rome the stability it needed to grow, and grow it did. The city that was once just a tiny speck on the Italian peninsula would go on to conquer vast territories, from the islands of the Mediterranean to the forests of Gaul, from the deserts of North Africa to the British Isles. Rome became an empire, but its roots, those humble wolf-filled roots, were never forgotten. The Romans always looked back on their origins with a sense of pride. They knew that they had come from nothing and they had built something truly extraordinary. And what about the myths? The story of Romulus and Remus, while probably not entirely true, became a powerful symbol for the Romans. It represented their belief in destiny, the idea that Rome was meant to be great, that it was fated to rule. The legend of the twins, raised by a wolf and destined to found a great city, became a metaphor for Rome's resilience, its ability to survive and thrive against all odds. But let's not forget the other side of Rome's story. While the city's rise was undeniably impressive, it wasn't always pretty. Rome was built on a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, literally. The early kings, like Romulus and Tarquinius Superbus, were often brutal in their quest for power, and even after the Republic was established, Rome's expansion was fueled by conquest, slavery, and warfare. The Romans weren't exactly gentle rulers, and their empire was maintained through force as much as it was through diplomacy and governance. Yet, despite all the violence and conflict, Rome's influence on the world cannot be overstated. From their legal systems to their roads, from their architecture to their language, the Romans left a lasting legacy that we still feel today. Latin, the language of the Romans, became the foundation for many modern languages, including Italian, French, Spanish, and even parts of English. Roman law influenced the legal systems of countless nations, and Roman engineering, like their roads and aqueducts, set the standard for infrastructure for centuries to come. And let's not forget Rome's cultural legacy. The Romans were great admirers of Greek culture, and they borrowed heavily from Greek art, literature, and philosophy. But they didn't just copy the Greeks, they made these things their own. Roman poets like Virgil and Ovid created masterpieces that are still read today, and Roman philosophers like Seneca and Cicero left behind writings that continue to inspire thinkers around the world. The Romans took the best of what other cultures had to offer and added their own unique twist, creating a rich, diverse civilization that influenced every corner of the ancient world. In the end, the story of Rome's beginnings is about more than just a city. It's about a people who refused to give up, who overcame obstacles that would have crushed most others, and who believed in their destiny to rule. Rome wasn't built in a day, and it wasn't built without struggle, but it was built on a foundation of determination, resilience, and a whole lot of luck. And in the centuries that followed, Rome would go on to shape the world in ways that few other civilizations ever have. So the next time you're stuck in traffic on a road that was probably inspired by Roman engineering, or you're reading about the latest legal case in a system that traces its roots back to Roman law, take a moment to remember where it all started, not with marble temples or grand armies, but with a pair of twins, a she-wolf, and a ragtag group of outcasts trying to make their way in a dangerous world. Rome may have started small, but it sure knew how to dream big. If you enjoyed this dive into the wild world of ancient Rome, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your favorite part of the Romulus and Remus legend. Do you think they really were raised by a wolf, or is that just ancient Rome's version of a tall tale? Let's keep the conversation going. And as always, stay curious and keep exploring history with us.